Today we're starting a new sermon series called Doors and Windows. Doors are, of course, places of transition. We talk of opportunities as doors opening and closing. We go inside and outside through the doors of our houses. Jesus advised us to enter through the narrow door. He told us to seek that we might find, to knock that the door might be opened. He said, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." And we think of Jesus knocking, and if we're going to let him into the doors of our hearts, are we going to let him in? Doors are places of transition. When we move from one place to another, we wonder, at least I do, to what degree we become different people in different contexts and situations. Are we the same at work as at home? Are we the same out in the world as we are at church? It may be easy for us to keep faith in some places and hard in others. I often wonder if I'm the same when I'm playing a sport as when I'm doing something else, right? Get more competitive. This study series will focus on some of the important doors that we find in the Bible. It will challenge us to think about the places we are going, about who we're letting in and who we're keeping out. And it will ask us to think about the place we give Jesus in our travels. Are we walking with the Lord in the way that we should be? And of course, we're focusing on doors, but we also have windows in there. And one of the things that we're going to be celebrating next week, as a matter of fact, is the completion of our stained glass window project. Everybody's been asking about that last window that's been there for some time. Well, next week, we'll have that window there. It'll be covered up. We'll reveal it. But we'll also spend all Sunday talking about the various windows that are here. So it'll be a very different kind of service, celebrating the stained glass. We'll be hearing from the artists. We'll also be inviting you all to tell us what these windows mean to you. They're different. We'll talk about their meaning and how we went about getting them, designing them, and just the whole process there. So hopefully it'll be a fun Sunday of celebration when we talk about those windows. That'll be next Sunday. So hopefully you'll all join us then. Today, we're going to be looking at a door, the Passover door. This is the most difficult passage we're going to be looking at in this entire series, so I like to hit the ground running, start off the new year with a tough one. A little bit of background on this. As you recall, the Hebrew people were wandering around throughout Palestine when a famine hit. And following Joseph, Jacob and his other 11 sons migrated to Egypt, where they lived for a time in relative prosperity. Things were good for them there until there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And then the Hebrew people, instead of living off the good and fat of the land, were reduced to slavery, forced into slave labor for the Egyptians. And we know that as their numbers grew, even in their servitude, they were seen as a threat. And so they were violently oppressed. Their children were killed. We know drowned in the river Nile. And we know that they were tortured and abused in other ways. Moses, had grown up in that environment, narrowly rescued from drowning himself, had seen the oppression of his people and had acted upon it, killed an Egyptian taskmaster, and so forced to flee, had gone out into the wilderness where he had spent many years herding sheep when he saw a burning bush. We, of course, have a window showing that. That burning bush was where he encountered God and was commissioned by him to go and rescue his people. So Moses traveled to Egypt, and there he met with Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh responded as we would expect him to. This was a challenge to his authority and his power and his might. And so he said, "Not a chance." He went to them and said, "I hear you want to go. You're lazy, lazy, lazy." He doubled their tasks, made their work harder, and abused them more. Then we have this story in the Bible of the first 9 plagues. Things that were visited upon the Egyptians to get them to change their mind, to think about what they had undergone, and to get them to release their slaves and allow them to be free. Well, after 9 of those, nothing had really changed. Pharaoh was holding fast to his guns, and you can imagine how difficult it would be for him to admit defeat. What would it mean for him to say, I've got to let these people go? Their God is more powerful than I am, and I'm a God myself. What does that say for him and for his future? So that's where our story picks up here, and we're going to be looking at Exodus chapter 12, verses 21 through 30. So Moses then summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. So here we get the origins of Passover, one of the three major celebrations of the Jewish people even today. So they celebrate Sukkoth, their kind of version of Thanksgiving. They celebrate Pentecost, and they celebrate Passover. And in our minds, Passover is perhaps the most important one because it celebrates the creation of the Hebrew people, how they were rescued from slavery, brought out, given the law, and established in the Promised Land. So this commemorates the Passover. And here we get it. This verse 22, take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood in the basin, and put some on the blood on the top and on both sides of the door frame. None of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. So here's what they're supposed to do. Take a lamb, they're going to kill it, and we know they're going to eat it. They're going to share it amongst themselves. And in fact, Jewish custom said that all of the lamb had to be eaten by the next morning. So they said, if your family is not big enough, get other families to share in with you so that you can make sure it's all gone. And whatever you don't eat the next day has to be burned up. So it's going to be gone. You only get one day. There are no leftovers on this meal. Some of you probably eat that way anyway. Don't like leftovers. But anyhow, they take the blood and they use hyssop. Hyssop's a plant. I was trying to think of something like that. It'd be like taking some of our decorative grasses and using them. It's just meant to be a disposable paintbrush that you can use here temporarily, and you're supposed to take the blood and put it on the door frame. And the idea is it's covering both sides of it, and it's like a barrier you're putting up. I don't know if you've ever, I went to the coast once where I went to this crab shack, and they had the weirdest thing there. They had these bags of water hanging from it. Have you guys seen this place? Crab shack, so there's flies everywhere outside, and they won't go underneath the water. It's the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life. There's something about water hanging in the doorway that keeps them out. It also means you got to duck, and you think you're going to get your head dunked in water. But anyhow, here's this barrier meant to keep out this negative thing and keep you safe inside. That's the whole purpose of this. So here we go. None of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe and will pass over that doorway, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your house and strike you down. So the plague that's coming is the death of the firstborn. This horrific plague, the last and greatest and worst of them all. And this is to be the protection for them to put this sign on their doors. And now we get these words, obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. So this isn't a one-time thing. God is acting in this mighty way, but they're going to be remembering this forever. And they're going to be doing acts always to remember. And so today, Jewish people get together for a Passover Seder, a special celebratory meal that takes about 2.5, 3 hours. We've done them here in our church at various times, and they're quite challenging to go through all the rituals and all the things that are a part of this, to remember how they were slaves in Egypt and to remember how God rescued them with a mighty hand. It says in verse 25, when you enter the land the Lord will give you as he promised, observe this ceremony. So they're not to forget it. And when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? Because this is supposed to be a teaching moment, then tell them it's the Passover sacrifice to the Lord who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. So we were spared, the angel of death, the Lord passed over them. And then it says, then the people bowed down and worshiped. The Israelites did just what the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of the livestock as well. And Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. So this terrible plague comes along. Now, what do we get from this? First thing I want to lift up for you is just, wow. Hearing about the death of the firstborn probably causes us all to cringe. It's such a horrific thing to take place. And we wonder, was it necessary? Why did this have to happen? And of course, well, we see in other books of the Bible where they challenge this kind of activity. Think of the book of Jonah. Yeah, the Assyrians, these terrible people, are wreaking havoc all throughout the ancient world, and Jonah the prophet is given a word: go there and testify to them and tell them to repent and to change. And he doesn't want to do it because he doesn't want them to change. He wants them to all be destroyed. That's what he wants, because he hates them. And I tell people, if you really want to understand that story, think of them as the Nazis of their day. It's like asking a Jewish rabbi to go and pray for the Nazis in the midst of the Holocaust. Nobody wants to do that. He doesn't want to go. And when he gets there, he gives this word, and everybody repents, and he goes, oh, he's so unhappy with God. And he's sitting there mourning, and God says, listen, there are people in there, children who are too young to know their left hand from their right. There are animals that are innocent in there. How can you want this destruction to come upon them? And yet here, the destruction does come on just exactly those people that God said are deserving of sympathy and care, right? On the animals and on these other children that are presumably innocent in every single way. So this destruction comes, and we wonder, why was it necessary? Well, we do have the fact that there were 9 plagues before this, right? And 9 plagues weren't enough. We know that in the ancient world, in Jewish thought, but also in Canaanite religion and in Egyptian, the firstborn were set apart as being sacred, as belonging especially to God. And probably the Egyptians felt that they had this special connection with them through their gods. We also know that, in a certain sense, 10 plagues weren't enough. After this horrible plague, Pharaoh temporarily relents, but then what does he do almost immediately? He goes after him again, because that apparently even wasn't enough. One of the commentaries I was reading about this says, we underestimate frequently the stubbornness of evil. And I was thinking about that. When evil is really there, it often doubles down and doubles down and doubles down. We just have to look at our own history. Look at the Civil War. What did Grant say of Lee? He said, rarely has such a good man fought for such a terrible cause. It's a terrible cause. And yet people wanted slavery so badly, they wanted their way of life, they didn't want to change so badly that even after there was great destruction, all these other states had fallen, even after the march on Georgia, even after Appomattox, people still wanted to fight. They still wanted to hold on to their traditions. So we see the assassination of Lincoln. We see other people planning insurrection in various ways. Or how about World War II? The Germans set out to establish this Reich that would last 1,000 years. And yet, clearly, after a time, it was obvious they were going to lose. Little bit by little bit, their empire is being eaten away until finally Germany itself was under attack. And as Berlin is being assaulted by the Russians, what does Hitler do? He doesn't just surrender. He says, let's call up the little children to go fight in the Hitlerjugend, and let's also get the old folks and get them out there into the very last bit. Or the Japanese. I'm somewhat of a World War II buff, and I've been reading about this lately, about the invasion. We think of how horrible it was that we had to we could argue that. But, we did the fire bombings, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. Then we did the A-bomb. And yet, I was reading this about how when that happened, there were still people there in the Japanese cabinet who were saying, we shouldn't surrender. We should continue to fight on. We may lose 20 million of our citizens, but that was their estimate as well as ours about how many citizens would die in the invasion of the islands. 20 million citizens, if we can survive, that's worth it. And you go, wow, stubbornness of evil. What does it take for us to admit when we're wrong? We often talk about that as individuals. How do we hit bottom? What does it take to get us there? And we hope that we're not people who are so stubborn, clinging on to our ways when they're wrong, that we can't admit and allow God's healing power to come in. But Pharaoh can't do that. He's stubborn to the very end. And then we think of the blood on the door. That's such an odd thing, too. Is this like a magic charm? What does blood represent in the Bible? Not a hard question, what? Life. It represents life. And so we often think of it representing our lives. When we give an offering here even, I realize it's money, but it represents our labors, our work. We often tell people that it isn't just about this, it's about our time, our energy, our money, our prayers, all of what makes us who we are, that we're committing and dedicating to God and for His service and for His purposes. Represents life. And this is, of course, a time when their lives have been held captive by the Egyptians. They have been forced to labor. They have not been their own. They have been living in slavery and in darkness, and so they finally say, we need to be free, and we're willing to take whatever risks are necessary. And so they take this outward sign and they put it on their doors as a symbol of their lives and their commitment to this cause, right? It's an outward and visible sign of something they believe. And we often talk about this and wonder about this today, especially in Protestantism. We're not real big on outward signs. We don't make the mark of the cross. We don't say that you have to have these things, but aren't there signs that are necessary in our lives if we're really going to be followers of Jesus Christ? There was a question that they've asked frequently recently about if you were put on trial for Christianity, would there be enough evidence in your life to convict you? Are you living out your life in such a way that people could see signs of it in your life? And what about physical signs? When I was a young person, I remember traveling on bus going across country, and I had a Bible with me that I was trying to read every day, and I brought out the Bible, and I felt so self-conscious because here I am with a Bible, and everybody can look at me and see me. And then I thought, well, what kind of faith is it that I'm afraid to show that I'm reading a Bible? I mean, that's kind of sad, isn't it? What about things that we're willing to do? Pray in a restaurant. Confess to people, share with them, pray with them. You could draw lines on where they are. And what about people who don't have outward signs of the faith? Our youth group went a number of years ago to Glide Memorial Methodist Church down in California. And, they're famous for their mission outreach. But when they were there, guess what this church had done? They had taken all the Bibles and the crosses out of the church. And we're talking about that as a good thing. What would you think about a church that took all the Bibles and the crosses out of the church? I think that's a bad thing, right? We have those as outward visible signs of what we believe and think, right? And where we're at. What are the outward and visible signs that we have in our lives today? That's a good question for us to think about. What we are willing to show that manifests our faith and what's essential for us in what we believe. What are our outward signs? And then I will tell you, those signs change, I think, because there's sometimes when you just have to make a statement of faith. Here at this Passover time, they had to take this blood of the lamb and put it on the doorpost because that was an essential thing for them to show their commitment to God. It was essential to separate themselves from the Egyptians and their way of life and their way of being, to say we're not going to be a part of that anymore. There was a story in World War II about the King of Denmark. I don't know if you knew this, but during World War II, when the Nazis took power, they frequently made the Jews wear these armbands that showed the Star of David. And they gave that order in Denmark. That's what the King of Denmark said. He said, well, I don't think that's a good thing, but if they have to wear them, then I think that I will start wearing one as well. And he encouraged everybody in Denmark to wear a Star of David. And you go, that's probably a good statement of faith, isn't it? At a time when it was necessary. We're not participating in this activity that they're a part of. We're going to stand up against it, even if it costs us and puts us at risk. You imagine these Hebrew people marking their door frames in this way, setting themselves apart. That probably was a risky move to make during this time and was a statement of faith, an outward statement of what they believed and thought. And then you get this whole idea of, Jesus and the connections that we make between this story and our faith. We have over here a stained glass window of a lamb, and it's a Passover lamb. And you see there it's got this thing around the top. That's to indicate divinity, so it's supposed to let us know that that's Jesus. And we often talk about Jesus being our Passover lamb. Well, what does that mean, to call Jesus our Passover lamb? Here you have this story of a lamb that is killed. Its blood is marked as a sign of protection, of cleansing, of separation. And what we're really saying is Jesus is the one who died for us that we might be freed from sin and death. We receive his blood, his life, so that we can live differently and be a different kind of people than we were before, freed from our past. We make all these connections between the Passover lamb that was sacrificed, and in fact, I would say that our connection, seeing that in Jesus, speaks to us today more powerfully than the story of the Passover lamb, right? To make those connections with Jesus and to see him in the story. This story also talks about the importance of remembering, how important it is to remember things. Now, we say that also when we take communion. Jesus said, "Do this as often as you will in remembrance of me." And I always try to tell folks that remembering doesn't mean recalling something that was in the past or remembering it in the sense of it's a historical fact. It really means remembering something that makes a difference in my life today. So I try to compare this with maybe this happened in your family. My family would occasionally say, they'd see somebody doing something and they'd say, "That's not something we do in our family. We're Grimsteads." Okay? The idea here is we're Christians. We're supposed to live in a different way. Jesus died for us. This story tells us something, though, too. The Jewish people are supposed to share this, and this is just an interesting thing for you to think about. Of course, the stories of the Old Testament, the stories of the Jewish people, the Hebrews, are meant to be the stories of our spiritual ancestors as well. How much do we read ourselves into their stories? When the Jewish people take Passover, one of the things they say is, we were slaves once in Egypt. Think of that. We were slaves once. It's making it contemporaneous for the people today. And I remember reading this in a class not too long ago. I'm ashamed to say I didn't glom onto this earlier, but a while back I was reading this story, and some of the commentators said, "Do you see yourself then as having been a slave?" And I thought, I've never thought of myself that way. I've always thought of myself as an American who, we're free, right? But this story sort of spiritually connects us to that experience. What does that say? We were slaves once, but we've been made free. Certainly that's true for us for sin and death in our lives today as Christians, but also, wow, if we were freed as a part of the Hebrew people, our spiritual ancestors, that means we have a role and responsibility to free people today in the same way, to act as God's instruments, liberating people in various ways from the things that are oppressing them and holding them down. Then to remember, to make it alive for us today. We're going to be celebrating the sacrament of Holy Communion in just a few minutes. And when we take communion, I think it's really important that we do remember. What is it that we're remembering? Not in the sense of an historical fact that happened, but something that enables us to feel a power today. What are we remembering when we take communion? So I'll throw that out to you. What do we remember when we take communion? Anybody? Salvation. There's a salvation power available for me now. What else? Yeah, Jesus rose from the dead, and because he rose, I can live too. Right? It's not just he's not a dead God who's absent from the picture. He's alive today and here with us. What do we say? It says, "This is my body, this is my blood." We have the life of Jesus being offered to us. What else are we remembering? So what? The covenant that we have with God. A covenant is an agreement that God has made. And God is faithful to his agreements. He has promised us things, and we can trust the promises that God has given us. I heard somebody else with one. Sacrifice that he made. And I tell folks this, a sacrifice is giving up something you love for something you love more. The sacrifice of Jesus on the cross reveals the greatness of his love for us. He loved us enough to die for us, to give his life for us. All right? All this. In fact, when we take communion, I often tell folks there's a surplus of meaning here. So that literally we could go and look at this week after week after week and come up with different angles to look at it, right? That's part of the message that we want to hear in this. So when we remember, it's not remembering historical facts, it's remembering what it means for me and how it changes my life today. That's what we want to get from this. Okay, we're going to have a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for this message, hard as it is for us to hear. We know that the Bible tells us about real people who were struggling in many ways, and who we know that history, as you act through it, is often written in blood. We remember how you freed your people, and how that was not a joyous thing for them, but a thing that they remembered with pain in their hearts for the loss of the Egyptians. We also know that it was something, though, that where they were freed, that they could be your people and live in a new way. So bless us as we seek to leave our past behind, to live in you, to enjoy the life that is ours in you, and the freedom from sin and death that are available to us in Jesus Christ. All this we lift up in Christ's name. Amen.